September 1851 brought a lingering heat to Prince Edward County, Virginia, the kind that made the air shimmer above the tobacco fields and filled the grand houses with the smell of damp plaster and fading flowers. At Belmont Estate, Thomas Rutledge watched from the veranda as a wagon rolled slowly up the long drive, its wheels crunching against gravel, still soft from the morning rain. Inside the wagon sat the new purchase, an enslaved person named Jordan, recently acquired from a physician's estate in Richmond under circumstances that no one fully understood. Thomas's wife, Catherine, waited in the shade of the veranda column, her pale hands clasped tightly around her handkerchief. The household staff had gathered at a respectful distance, their eyes lowered but their curiosity palpable. They had seen new slaves arrive before, but none quite like this one. Jordan was small, fine-boned, neither distinctly male nor female at first glance, with an unsettling stillness in their posture that drew the eye. When the overseer helped them down from the wagon, several of the field hands exchanged uneasy glances. "Is this the one?" Catherine asked softly. Thomas nodded. "Yes. The physician's papers describe an anomaly of nature. Perfectly healthy otherwise." Catherine frowned. "An anomaly? That sounds like something out of a carnival." Her husband's mouth twitched in irritation. "A medical rarity," he said, as though the distinction mattered. "A genuine hermaphrodite. The condition is exceptionally rare." The Jordans stood silent while the couple spoke, their expression unreadable, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the house. Sweat gleamed faintly on their brow, but they showed no sign of exhaustion or fear. Only that stillness, that peculiar calm, as if they had already seen every horror the world could offer and found it unremarkable. Harriet, the house cook, whispered to the maid beside her, "Lord help us, there's something not right about that one." The maid crossed herself. "Ain't our place to say." Thomas dismissed the workers with a curt nod and instructed the overseer to bring Jordan inside. The slave was taken not to the quarters behind the kitchen, as new arrivals usually were, but directly into the main house, a decision that caused murmurs throughout the estate before the day was done. That evening, Catherine insisted on inspecting the new acquisition herself. Jordan stood before her in the parlor, illuminated by the flicker of the oil lamps. Catherine studied the figure for a long moment, her eyes lingering on the delicate line of the neck, the smallness of the wrists, the way Jordan's gaze never faltered. "You understand your duties?" she asked. "Yes, mistress," Jordan replied quietly. Their voice was soft but carried an unexpected clarity, a tone that seemed to resonate in the air long after they stopped speaking. "You will assist me in the household," Catherine continued. "You'll attend to my wardrobe, my correspondence, and my room. Do you sew?" "Yes, mistress." "And cook?" "When needed." Catherine hesitated. Something about the evenness of those answers, the utter absence of emotion, unnerved her. She dismissed Jordan with a nod and turned away. That night, in their bedroom, Thomas could barely contain his excitement. He spoke rapidly about anatomy, about the possibilities of documentation and study, about what the medical community in Richmond might pay for a detailed report. Catherine listened in silence, her expression tightening. "You bought a person, Thomas," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Not a specimen." He smiled thinly. "The two are not mutually exclusive." She stared at him for a long moment before turning away, extinguishing the lamp without another word. The next weeks passed in uneasy quiet. Jordan adapted quickly to life inside the house, moving through rooms with a quiet grace that unsettled everyone. They spoke only when spoken to, followed instructions precisely, and never seemed to tire. The other enslaved people avoided them. The field hands whispered that Jordan had no shadow, that their eyes reflected candlelight, even when unlit, that no one had ever seen them sleep. Harriet, ever superstitious, sprinkled salt across the kitchen threshold each night, just in case. Thomas spent long hours in his study, poring over the medical records that had accompanied the bill of sale. They contained anatomical sketches, measurements, and notations written in the precise hand of a physician who had clearly viewed Jordan as a scientific marvel rather than a human being. At first, Thomas told himself he was merely curious, that he was honoring the pursuit of knowledge. But the truth was that the curiosity had already curdled into something darker, fascination. He found excuses to summon Jordan to his study. He would ask innocuous questions about their health, their childhood, their habits. But beneath those questions was an unspoken hunger. To understand, to possess, to define. Jordan answered each inquiry with perfect calm, their composure only fueling Thomas's obsession. "Do you ever wonder why God made you as you are?" he asked one evening. Jordan looked at him steadily. "Do you, Master?" The question startled him more than he cared to admit. He dismissed them abruptly, and spent the rest of the night pacing before the fire, feeling something in himself shift and break. Catherine, meanwhile, watched all of this from a distance, her unease growing daily. She had noticed the way her husband's eyes followed Jordan, the way his voice softened when he spoke to them. It stirred in her not jealousy exactly, but something more complex. A mixture of fear and fascination. One afternoon, she called Jordan to her dressing room, under the pretense of needing help with her corset. As Jordan tightened the laces, Catherine caught their reflection in the mirror. Their faces were close. So close she could feel the warmth of their breath. For a moment, she was struck by the strangeness of that face, the symmetry that was almost too perfect, the androgynous beauty that defied classification. "Do you know what people say about you?" Catherine asked. "Yes, mistress. That you're unnatural." Though Jordan met her gaze in the mirror. "Perhaps I am, but so are most of the things people fear." The words sent a chill through her. She dismissed Jordan quickly. But long after they had gone, she found herself standing before the mirror, tracing her own reflection, as though searching for some hidden imperfection. By mid-October, Belmont had settled into a rhythm that seemed outwardly normal, but pulsed with something poisonous beneath the surface. The other slaves worked the fields, the house ran on routine, and the Rutledges attended to the social obligations of their class as best they could. But anyone who paid attention could see that something was wrong. Thomas grew restless, irritable, increasingly isolated. He stopped visiting town, stopped writing letters, stopped sleeping through the night. Catherine withdrew as well, declining invitations, wandering the house in silence. And through it all, Jordan remained a quiet constant, moving through rooms like a shadow, untouched by the fever that seemed to consume their masters. One night, Catherine woke to find Thomas's side of the bed empty. She rose and followed the faint glow of lamplight up the stairs to the third floor, to the room that had once been her father-in-law's study. Through the cracked door, she saw her husband seated at his desk, Jordan standing before him. Thomas was speaking in low, urgent tones, words Catherine couldn't make out. Jordan's expression was unreadable. Then, as if sensing her presence, they turned their heads slightly. For the briefest instant, their eyes met through the doorway. Catherine felt her breath catch. Not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't see. There was no fear in those eyes. No submission, only an infinite, quiet endurance that seemed older than the house itself. When she returned to bed, Catherine could still hear her husband's voice, echoing faintly through the floorboards, mingling with Jordan's silence in a way that felt less like conversation and more like confession. And though she would never admit it, not to herself, not to anyone, part of her understood that something irreversible had begun. In the weeks following Catherine's fainting spell, Belmont Estate seemed to breathe with a nervous tension. Servants moved quietly through the halls, voices lowered to murmurs, as though sound itself might wake something that preferred to sleep. Even the house dogs, creatures normally indifferent to human anxiety, grew restless, pacing the veranda through the night, staring at corners of darkness with hackles raised. Thomas Rutledge told himself these were coincidences, tricks of weather and imagination. Yet, in the still hours before dawn, when the lamplight guttered and his brandy soared on his tongue, he began to feel watched. By what? He could not say. It was as though the house, or something within it, had turned its gaze upon him and would not look away. Catherine's health did not improve. She grew pale and distracted, her hands trembling when she poured tea, her eyes losing focus mid-conversation. At first Thomas attributed it to the Virginia summer, its oppressive humidity, the endless chorus of cicadas. But soon her condition became impossible to dismiss. She spoke of hearing footsteps in the upper rooms, when no one was there, of whispers in the walls that ceased whenever she called for a servant. "Old houses have memories," Thomas said once, attempting reassurance. "Wood settles, rats move in the beams." Catherine's laugh was brittle as glass. "Those are not the sounds of settling wood. And what rat breathes like a person standing behind the door?" He could not answer. The physician from Farmville prescribed laudanum and rest, and suggested perhaps the lady might benefit from a season in Richmond. But Catherine refused to leave Belmont. "It would follow me," she said quietly, when Thomas urged her to go. "You think this house is haunted, but you are mistaken. The haunting is in us." Thomas tried to reason with her, but her words sank like stones into his conscience. He had begun to feel it too, that the unease infecting Belmont did not come from outside, but from something festering within the household itself. At the center of that infection, though neither would name it, stood Jordan. Jordan went about their duties with quiet precision, tending fires, cleaning the study, assisting the housekeeper. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about their behavior, no defiance, no insolence, but their very presence seemed to disturb the natural order of things. Servants avoided being alone with them. Children of the neighboring plantation families stared and whispered. When Catherine's illness worsened, it was Jordan who sat at her bedside, cooling her fever with damp cloths and reading aloud from the family Bible in a soft, low voice. Thomas, watching from the doorway one evening, was struck by the strange calm that seemed to descend upon the room whenever Jordan spoke. The house's restless air grew still, even the flickering candlelight steadied, as though listening. He told himself this was gratitude, that Catherine's comfort mattered more than the servant's unsettling presence. But the explanation rang hollow. A month later, Catherine insisted on hosting a small dinner for two neighboring families, a desperate attempt to reassert normalcy. The evening began well enough. The table glittered with polished silver, the conversation polite and measured. Yet as the meal progressed, unease crept in. One guest remarked on a chill draft, though every window was closed. Another swore she heard someone humming from the corridor beyond the parlor, though no one was there. When the clock struck 9, the candles on the dining table guttered simultaneously, and for one long second the room plunged into darkness. Several guests gasped. When the flame returned, Catherine was standing rigidly beside her chair, eyes fixed on something just beyond the door. "Do you see it?" she whispered. Thomas followed her gaze. There was nothing, only the polished hallway, the reflection of light on the floorboards. The next morning, every servant reported nightmares. Some dreamed of fire, others of a shadow moving along the walls. One young girl claimed she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed, neither man nor woman, watching her with eyes like moonlight on water. Thomas dismissed these stories publicly, yet privately he could not escape the thought that the house was recording everything. The tension, the grief, the guilt, in its timber and plaster like ink soaking into paper. Catherine began keeping to her rooms. She wrote letters she never sent, pages upon pages of neat handwriting that she would later tear into shreds and burn in the fireplace. Her voice grew faint, as though each word cost her strength. Sometimes Thomas found her standing at the third-floor window, staring toward the slave quarters. "What do you look for?" he asked once. Her reply came after a long silence. "Forgiveness, perhaps. Though I doubt I would recognize it if it came." He wanted to press her further, but something in her tone, the exhausted finality, stopped him. By autumn, the rhythms of the estate had decayed. The harvest was late, the overseer inattentive, the fields quiet. Even the enslaved workers spoke less, their songs replaced by uneasy silence. One older woman, known for her wisdom, told Thomas bluntly, "The land remembers, Master Rutledge. You can't plant peace in soil that's tasted blood." That night, Thomas dreamed of Belmont burning. He woke drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke vivid in his nostrils. But the air was still, the house silent. Only the cicadas sang outside his window, endless and indifferent. In the following weeks, strange events multiplied. Silver tarnished overnight. Milk curdled in the pantry. The family Bible, kept open on the parlor table, was found one morning with every page blank. Thomas accused the servants of some malicious prank, until he turned the pages himself, and saw the faint impression of words that had once been there, as if erased by unseen hands. Catherine's condition worsened beyond remedy. She no longer spoke of whispers or figures, but instead of echoes. That word repeated often. "There are echoes everywhere," she said to Jordan one night, her voice barely audible. "Not of sound, but of souls. They want to be remembered." Jordan listened without expression. When Thomas entered the room, Catherine turned toward him with a look of infinite weariness. "It's not their fault," she said. "It's ours." Those were the last coherent words she ever spoke to him. By winter, Catherine had withdrawn entirely into silence. She ate little, slept less, and seemed to exist in a twilight between waking and dream. Jordan remained by her side until the end, tending her with quiet devotion. Thomas, meanwhile, began avoiding his own reflection. He found that mirrors in the house no longer faithfully showed his face. In their depths, he saw something behind him. Shapes that shifted when he turned. Shadows that did not align with his movements. He ordered every mirror in Belmont removed. The house grew darker, its remaining light thin and uneven. The servants whispered that the master was going mad, and perhaps he was. Then, one rain, slick night, a scream tore through the halls. A sound so sharp and sudden it silenced the entire house. When Thomas reached Catherine's room, he found her kneeling beside the window, her hands bloody, her eyes wide and unseeing. The window was unbroken. The blood was her own. She whispered something he could barely hear. "It has seen us." And then she smiled. A small, terrible smile, and fainted. When the scream broke Belmont's long silence, every servant in the house swore. Later they felt the walls vibrate, as if the sound had traveled not through air, but through timber. By the time Thomas reached Catherine's room, the echo had already died, leaving behind a stillness that seemed almost viscous, a silence thick enough to choke on. He sent for Dr. Alaric Harrow of Farmville, a discreet man, accustomed to the peculiar ailments of the region's wealthy planters. Harrow arrived before dawn, his carriage wheels sinking into the wet clay of the drive. In his journal, later discovered among his effects, he described the scene with clinical brevity. Mrs. Rutledge was found in a state of nervous exhaustion bordering on catatonia. Hands lacerated, though wounds not life-threatening. Pupils dilated unevenly, expression alternating between vacancy and alarm. Patient muttered intermittently of the reflection, and the thing in the upper room. Harrow recommended immediate rest, seclusion, and reduced stimulation. Thomas, desperate for any remedy that might restore his wife's composure, agreed to every suggestion. Catherine was moved from her bedroom to the small chamber at the north end of the third floor, the only room in the house without mirrors, and, until then, used only for storage. From the moment she entered it, that room began to change. At first, it was only the temperature. Even with a fire blazing, the air remained unnaturally cool, as though the walls themselves exhaled frost. Later, the servants refused to enter at all. They claimed that the shadows in that room moved of their own accord, that the flame of a lamp bent away from the walls, as if repelled by some unseen presence. Thomas dismissed such talk as superstition, but privately, even he could not deny the strange unease that clung to the place. Harrow visited daily for a week, then less frequently. Each visit produced new entries in his ledger, observations more disturbed and more uncertain than the last. January 14, 1852. Patient reports persistent auditory hallucinations, soft whispering, intelligible only as her own name repeated. Servant Jordan corroborates the occurrence of unusual noises, though denies seeing the speaker. Pulse irregular, sleep fragmented. January 22. Patient insists her reflection has separated from her person, requests all reflective surfaces removed. Husband confirms he has already done so throughout household. February 30. Patient's speech increasingly elliptical. Speaks of the thing beneath the floor, and of hearing its breath through the cracks at night. I detect no drafts or architectural defects sufficient to explain this. Harrow was a rational man, but his notes began to betray something like dread. On February 10, he wrote simply, "Oh, I no longer trust the evidence of my senses within this house." Meanwhile, Thomas's own condition was deteriorating. He spent his nights pacing the corridors outside Catherine's door, unable to sleep. His appetite vanished. He took to drinking heavily, though it seemed to have little effect. When he looked at Jordan, their calm, inscrutable face illuminated by the firelight, he felt both fascination and terror. There were moments when he believed he saw in Jordan the same shifting darkness that now haunted his wife. The slaves in the quarters whispered that Mistress Rutledge was possessed. Some said she had been cursed for her cruelty. Others claimed it was judgment upon the master himself. One older man, who had worked at Belmont since Thomas's childhood, told the cook that the house had swallowed something that shouldn't have been born, and that now it wanted to spit it back. Catherine's condition worsened as spring approached. She ceased speaking altogether for several days, then, without warning, began to write, endlessly, feverishly, pages upon pages filled with looping script, none of which made sense at first glance. When Thomas attempted to read them, he found lines repeating themselves, phrases written backward, words layered over each other, until they were illegible. One night, Jordan found him sitting at Catherine's desk, staring at a single page by candlelight. On it were the words, "The face behind the glass is not mine." He burned the paper immediately. Dr. Harrow, alarmed by the accelerating decline, proposed a form of treatment, fashionable among continental physicians. A therapeutic bleeding combined with isolation. Thomas consented, though he did not fully understand the procedure. It was to be performed privately, with Jordan assisting, as the servants had refused to enter the third floor entirely by that time. The treatment began on the evening of March 2, 1852. Harrow's final notes, recovered decades later, describe what happened in detached, almost desperate prose. At the commencement, patient calm though expression vacant. Vein opened successfully. Within minutes, patient began to convulse violently, eyes rolled upward. Spoke several words in unknown language, possibly a dialect of Gola, though none present could confirm. Temperature in room dropped noticeably. Flame of lamp extinguished without draft. Subject's skin took on bluish pallor despite minimal loss of blood. At 9:15 p.m., audible weeping heard from beneath the floorboards. Source indeterminate. Servant Jordan fainted. Mr. Rutledge ordered the procedure stopped. I bound the wound, restored patient as best as possible. House seemed to shudder. Felt in floor and glass panes. I am unable to explain this occurrence. The Catherine never fully recovered from that night. Her body lingered, but her mind seemed gone, replaced by a terrible serenity. She no longer spoke of echoes or reflections. She simply stared at anyone who entered the room with an expression of profound pity. Thomas dismissed Dr. Harrow soon after, insisting he could manage his wife's care himself. Harrow's departing note, left with the butler, read, "Belmont is unsound. Not in its masonry, but in its moral architecture. Whatever dwells there feeds upon secrecy. I advise immediate sale and removal." The advice was not taken. By April, the household existed in near silence. The slaves performed their work under the supervision of the overseer, but the fields grew neglected. Visitors were turned away at the gate. The mail went unanswered. Even the birds seemed to avoid the upper chimneys. Then, on the night of May 3rd, something changed. Jordan later told investigators they had been awakened by the sound of a pistol being cocked. They rushed to the 3rd floor, only to find the door to Catherine's room locked from within. Thomas's voice was audible for several seconds. Urgent, pleading, but the words indistinct. Then came a single sharp report, followed by silence. When the door was forced open, Catherine was dead. Thomas claimed it had been an accident. The pistol, he said, had discharged while she was handling it. An old heirloom of his father's, loaded without her knowledge. The magistrate, a family friend, accepted the explanation without question. Suicide would have complicated inheritance, property, and the family's reputation. An accident was simpler, cleaner. The funeral took place 3 days later at Christ Church in Farmville. Rain fell steadily, drenching the fields, streaking the black veils of the mourners. The enslaved stood apart at the edge of the burial ground, their expressions unreadable. When the coffin was lowered, the earth seemed to swallow the sound entirely, leaving only the soft rustle of wet leaves. In the quarters that night, the story began to change. They said the mistress had not died by her own hand, nor by accident, but that something in the upper room had claimed her. They said her scream still echoed in the rafters. They said her reflection was still waiting behind the glass. Thomas, meanwhile, moved through the days that followed like a man underwater. Mute, slow, unseeing, he ordered the 3rd floor room sealed. Workers scrubbed the blood from the floorboards, though the stains never quite disappeared. Then, he had the door locked, and the key thrown into the well. He told no one what he saw the night she died, but Jordan, standing silently at his side during the burial, knew enough to be afraid. After Catherine's burial, Belmont entered a period of silence so profound that even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb it. The servants moved with exaggerated care, each step measured, as though the very boards of the house might betray them. Thomas Rutledge no longer spoke unless necessity required it. His words, when they came, were soft, deliberate, almost tender, as if he feared that any louder sound might summon something better left asleep. The room where Catherine died was locked, as ordered. A heavy plank was nailed across its door. The key, flung into the well, vanished with a hollow echo that seemed to linger far too long. The workers who had scrubbed the floor swore they would never enter that chamber again. Even the most pragmatic among them, men who laughed at ghost stories, felt a deep wrongness there, like standing too near a grave that had not settled. For weeks, Thomas sat in his study, staring into the cold fireplace. He took no interest in the plantation's operations, in the accounts, or in the coming harvest. The ledgers piled high and went unbalanced. He did not care. The overseer, seeing his master's neglect, quietly began selling off supplies, tools, and livestock for his own gain. By autumn, much of Belmont's wealth was gone, though Thomas scarcely noticed. It was Jordan who finally brought him food, water, and, on occasion, letters from neighboring planters offering condolences. Thomas read none of them. He asked only once, in a voice raw from Dessous, "Does it speak to you too?" The Jordan did not answer. At night, Thomas wandered the corridors, pausing at the door of the sealed room. More than once, he was heard whispering to it, though what he said none could discern. Servants reported that he sometimes stood there for hours, motionless, his ear pressed to the wood as if listening for a reply. Once, Jordan found him asleep against the doorframe, his hand outstretched, palm flat against the lock. The weeks slipped into months. When at last he resolved to sell the estate, his decision was met with relief by all who lived under his roof. The workers prayed openly in thanks, even the enslaved whispered blessings in the quarters. Belmont had become an open wound, and all desired escape, but before any sale could be finalized, Thomas took 3 actions, each deliberate, each marked by an air of grim finality. First, he ordered the sealed room to remain so in perpetuity. The buyer must agree to it in writing, he insisted. The merchant from Petersburg, who expressed interest, found the stipulation eccentric but harmless. He signed without hesitation, thinking it a relic of superstition. Second, Thomas built a fire in his study and fed into it every record, every bill of sale, every note from Dr. Harrow, every line of Catherine's fevered writing. He burned his own journals, too, page by page. He did not read them first. Witnesses later said the smoke that rose from that fire had a peculiar smell, not of paper or ink, but of something sweet, almost floral, tinged with decay. Third, he sold nearly all the enslaved people tied to the estate. Families were torn apart, sent to different buyers across the county. The sales ledger from that month records each transaction in a careful, shaking hand. The final name entered there was Jordan. Yet when the day came, Thomas could not part with them. He cancelled the auction, paid the broker his fee, and kept Jordan in his service. No one could say why. Some speculated that guilt compelled him, others that fear did. Perhaps, deep within him, he believed that only Jordan's presence kept the shadows at bay. That without that witness, the house would consume him entirely. They left Belmont together before the first snow. Thomas purchased a modest dwelling in Lynchburg, a narrow brick house on a quiet street, its shutters perpetually closed. There, he lived as a recluse. The townspeople spoke of him rarely, and when they did, it was with the tone reserved for the unfortunate rather than the wicked. He was seen walking in the mornings, stooped, gray, a widower faded into anonymity. Jordan lived in a small upper room. They worked silently, tending to Thomas's needs with mechanical care. Whatever strange intimacy had existed between them at Belmont dissolved into formal distance. They were 2 survivors bound by shared ruin, each avoiding the other's gaze for fear of what might still be seen there. Visitors described the house as hushed. The air, one said, had the weight of confession unspoken. The wallpaper yellowed quickly, mirrors darkened at their edges, as if shadow were seeping inward from the frame. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors passing in the street heard a voice inside. Thomas's, speaking softly, though no other answered. Some said he was praying. Others said he was speaking to Catherine. In truth, he had begun to lose distinction between the two. Dr. Harrow, who had returned to Richmond after his final visit, received one last letter from Thomas in October 1852. The handwriting was unsteady, the ink pale. Only fragments were legible. I believe she is not gone. When the light fails, I hear her breathing through the wall. The reflection was never hers alone. Harrow did not reply. 2 weeks later, on the morning of November 3, 1852, Thomas was found dead in his bed. No sign of violence, no illness. His face bore an expression of something like relief. The attending physician, a different man this time, wrote in his report, "Heart failure, cause indeterminate. A body may yield to exhaustion of the spirit as surely as to disease." The estate, meager though it was, went to auction. Jordan was included in the inventory, listed as house servant, age indeterminate, health sound, character peculiar. They sold for $4,412, less than half their prior valuation. The buyer, a farmer from Appomattox County, dismissed rumors and took possession without incident. After that, Jordan disappears from the record entirely. Belmont itself, long abandoned, stood empty for nearly 3 years. Weeds overtook the drive. Vines crept through the shutter cracks. When finally the Petersburg merchant moved his family in, they found the house sound but oppressive. Servants refused to stay after dark. The third-floor corridor remained cold, no matter how fiercely the fire burned below. Against the contract stipulation, the new owner eventually ordered the sealed room opened. Curiosity triumphed over caution. The lock gave way easily, the hinges long rusted. Inside, the air was motionless and foul. The boards beneath the window were warped and stained. Faint shapes, like handprints, discolored the plaster. The workers who entered refused to remain longer than a few minutes. One reported hearing, from somewhere within the wall, a faint sigh, as of someone sleeping. The owner ordered the room emptied, scrubbed, repainted. But nothing truly changed. His family complained of strange drafts, of voices calling faintly in the night, of a figure glimpsed through the cracked door, just at the edge of sight. Within a year, they sold the estate at a loss and departed. 4 more families would repeat that pattern. By 1865, as the war raged and soldiers passed through the countryside, Belmont burned, whether by accident, by malice, or by something older and quieter, no one could say. The fire began in the sealed room, though no living person had entered it for months. Some said lightning struck the roof. Others swore they saw a woman's silhouette framed in the upper window before the flames consumed it. The house collapsed inward, a slow implosion of beam and ash. When the fire cooled, only the foundation remained, blackened brick outlines in the shape of a great wound upon the earth. For years afterward, travelers through the woods claimed to see faint light rising from that spot, as if from a lantern carried by unseen hands. Some said it was Catherine, searching for the reflection she lost. Others whispered it was Jordan, still bound to the place where their body, or their soul, had been divided. By the turn of the century, nature had reclaimed the land. Ivy draped the stones, oaks split the old foundation. Nothing remained of Belmont except the stories. The fragments passed from one generation to another, always in a whisper. And even now, the property is fenced and marked with signs no trespass, CPV land. The signs are new. No one knows who maintains them. No owner's name appears in the county records. Sometimes, on autumn nights, when the air grows cold and the moon rises over the ruined fields, local children dare each other to approach the old well. They say if you drop a pebble, you can still hear the key strike metal far below, followed by a second sound, a breath drawn in sharply from the dark. The legend endures, perhaps because, beneath it, something true remains. The first mention of Belmont in official records after the war came not from a local source, but from a yellowing letter tucked inside a box of unrelated correspondence at the Virginia Historical Society. The letter, dated 1872, described a house of ill fortune near Farmville, long since ruined by fire, where the air itself seemed uneasy. Docket, Lydia Harrow discovered it in the autumn of 1927, while researching rural religious revivals of the Reconstruction era. She might have ignored it, one among countless fragments of faded local gossip. But the phrase, "the air itself seemed uneasy," caught her attention. The name Rutledge appeared twice in the letter, once in reference to a scandal too dark for retelling, and once beside a marginal note, sealed documents, Lynchburg Probate Court, 1852. Lydia had an instinct for gaps in history, the silences that hinted at something deliberately erased. She sent for the files from Lynchburg and waited 3 weeks for a reply. When they arrived, the clerk's accompanying note was brief. Access restricted. Records sealed by order of circuit court. No cause given. That, of course, only deepened her curiosity. Within a month, she was on a train west, bound for Appomattox County, her notebooks packed alongside a portable typewriter and a camera. The leaves had begun to turn by the time she arrived. Locals spoke readily enough about old plantations in general terms, but when she asked about Belmont, their manner changed. One man told her quietly that there was nothing left worth seeing. Another woman, when pressed, said the place hadn't wanted company for a long time. The ruins were easy to find, half swallowed by pine and sweet gum, the foundations black with moss. A single chimney still stood, slanting like a monument to stubbornness. Lydia set up her camera and took 3 photographs, before realizing that the air around the chimney seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. Later in her notes, she wrote, "It feels as though the earth remembers something it would rather forget." In a hollow beneath the remaining bricks, she found shards of blue and white porcelain, an iron key fused with rust, and a scrap of charred wood with faint script still visible, half a name, Adan. She brushed soil from it and felt a strange shiver run through her arm, as if the ground itself exhaled through her fingertips. That night, in the boarding house where she stayed, Lydia dreamed of a locked door and of something, or someone, standing just behind it, patient, waiting. When she woke, her hands were covered in fine black dust. Over the following weeks, she pieced together fragments of the Rutledge story from estate inventories, faded newspapers, and plantation ledgers. She found references to a sale after 1852, to the mysterious disappearance of several enslaved people, and to the subsequent burning of the main house. But there were no birth records, no bills of sale for one name that appeared again and again in rumor. Jordan, only silence. In her journal she wrote, "There are people who live entire lives unrecorded, yet their absence is louder than any history written down. I believe Belmont's ruin is not merely physical, it is moral, spiritual, a void carved by human cruelty." By winter, Lydia had compiled enough to propose a paper for the American Historical Association. Erasure and the Southern Conscience, a study of absence in Virginia's plantation archives. But she never finished it. The last entry in her field notebook is dated February 2, 1920. Found something in the foundation pit. Not wood. Not stone. Looks like glass melted into shape by fire, but there's writing inside. Can't quite make it out in this light. We'll examine tomorrow. She did not write again. 3 days later, the boarding house owner reported that Dr. Harrow had not come down for breakfast. Her room was found in perfect order, her typewriter on the desk with a single sheet still rolled inside. It bore only 5 words, faint and uneven, as though typed by an unsteady hand. The glass record. In the summer of 1974, a graduate student named Elias Carver arrived at the University of Virginia archives with a cardboard box marked private. L. Harrow papers. It had been found during renovations at the old Farmville boarding house, sealed behind a false wall. Inside were water-stained notebooks, undeveloped photographic plates, and a warped piece of translucent material that looked neither like glass nor stone. Avon was a quiet student, more comfortable among documents than people. His dissertation on unrecorded histories of the antebellum South had stalled for lack of primary sources. The Harrow collection seemed like a miracle. He began with her field notes, fragments of plantation inventories, sketches of foundations, references to a burned house. Belmont. The name meant nothing to him at first, but as he read deeper, the atmosphere of those pages began to work on him. An undertone of dread disguised as scholarship. Harrow's last entries disturbed him most. The handwriting grew erratic, her phrasing shifting from precise observation to fevered confession. The air beneath the chimney feels alive, the ground will not rest. Even examined the strange, glass, object next. Under bright light, he saw faint letters embedded within it, as if ink had been trapped inside at the moment of melting. He borrowed a microscope from the geology department, and, after hours of adjustment, managed to make out a few legible words. 3rd floor, sealed, blood never left. He wrote the phrase in his notes and tried to laugh it off as metaphor. But that night, as he developed one of Harrow's photographic plates, an image appeared that shouldn't have been possible. The photograph showed the ruins of a house, the same site she'd described, but in the frame stood a doorway intact, closed, with something like light leaking from the edges. Evan looked up from the darkroom tray and felt the sudden conviction that he was not alone in the room. The red light flickered, then steadied. He turned, nothing there, but the smell of smoke lingered faintly, impossibly, in the air. Over the next weeks, His work became obsession. He skipped classes, slept in the archives, and spent hours staring at the melted glass under magnification. He thought he could see movement within it, tiny ripples like breath against fog. On September 17, the archivist on duty found his workspace in disarray. The microscope had been overturned, the desk lamp burned out, and the box containing the Harrow papers lay open and empty. Evan was gone. Campus police searched the grounds and the old Farmville boarding house where Harrow had stayed. In the cellar, they found a narrow cavity in the wall, just large enough for a box to have fit, and a single line scratched into the brick. She heard me. Neither Evan Carver nor the translucent object was ever recovered. University officials quietly sealed the remaining Harrow materials, citing preservation concerns. The collection remains closed to researchers. The digital veil, the Belmont materials resurfaced in 2023, not through scholarship but through a glitch. A graduate assistant at the university's digital lab, Nadia Vance, was tasked with migrating legacy microfilm to the new online catalog. Among the rolls misfiled under agricultural ledgers 1849 to 1856, she found a reel labeled in fading pencil, Rutledge, Harrow, restricted. There was no accession record, no curator note, only a brittle warning taped to the box. Do not reproduce. Do not digitize. The prohibition intrigued her. The reel looked fragile, its spools warped by time, but she threaded it through the scanner anyway. The first frames showed fragments of letters and inventories, mundane plantation data. Then, without transition, the images shifted. Photographs of a ruin. Then a series of blurred plates of what appeared to be walls scorched from within. The next set of frames froze the software. The screen filled with white noise that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Nadia thought she heard a hiss through her earbuds. Then words, too faint to catch. She unplugged her headset, restarted the system, and found the new file had saved under an unrecognizable name, Glassed Record. MUV. When she opened it, the video displayed not a photograph but motion, slow, grainy, and colorless. A hallway, perhaps. A door at the far end. The date, stamp at the bottom reads CPT 17 1974, the day Evan Carver vanished. Her first thought was that it was a prank by another student. Her second, that she was staring at archival evidence of something unexplainable. The file played for 48 seconds before the frame disintegrated into static. Just before it ended, a faint reflection appeared in the door's surface, a face, elongated by distortion, watching her directly. Nadia's supervisor dismissed her report, reminding her that old nitrate film often produced optical artifacts. But when she returned to the lab the next morning, the file had vanished from the database. In its place was a folder titled simply, Belmont. Inside were audio clips, crackling recordings of someone reading aloud from 19th century ledgers in a low, monotone voice. She didn't recognize the language at first. The phrases repeated, phrases that sounded like ritual instructions, but when she played them backward out of curiosity, the cadence became English again, and she understood one sentence perfectly. The sealed room must remain closed. Nadia contacted Professor Louise Pell, a historian who specialized in folklore transmission. Pell agreed to meet in person, but refused to discuss details over email, saying only, "If you have what I think you have, bring it at once. And don't look at the images after midnight." They met in a dim seminar room. Pell examined the real box without touching it. "Do you know the name Harrow?" she asked. "Yes," Nadia said. "A field researcher from the 1920s. Disappeared." Pell nodded slowly. "I found one of her letters in the Smithsonian collection. She wrote that the Belmont site was a door that remembers. You shouldn't have opened that file." That night, Nadia dreamed of the hallway again, longer this time, stretching past the frame of the screen. She walked toward the sealed door, drawn by a soft, rhythmic knocking from the other side. When she woke, her phone camera was recording. The footage showed her sitting upright in bed, whispering, "She heard me." In the following days, Small anomalies multiplied. Her reflection lagged half a second behind her movement. Documents on her desk rearranged themselves into an order matching Harrow's old notes. Even the air in the lab seemed charged, humming faintly around the scanner. On October 2nd, she received an anonymous email containing a single line of text. Belmont must stay buried. Attached was an image file. It showed a still from the Glasser record, MOV clip, but this time, the door was open. The university IT department launched a quiet investigation into a data breach. Nadia did not show up for the meeting. Her apartment was found undisturbed except for her laptop, which displayed a live feed of a hallway none of the investigators recognized. When they pulled the network plug, the image persisted for several seconds before fading to black. Forensics later found that the hard drive's last activity was an upload to an anonymous online archive under the tag 5 Belmont record. The upload timestamp was 3:17 a.m., the same minute Nadia's phone stopped transmitting location data. The file remains active. Researchers attempting to access it report that the video will not stream, but instead mirrors the viewer's own reflection for a moment before freezing. No one knows where the content is hosted or by whom. The university disavowed any connection to the Harrow or Carver materials, calling them apocryphal. Yet every few months, new data fragments appear, audio, images, half-corrupted transcriptions, always under the same tag, always time, stamped between September 17 and October 2. The archivists now refer to it as the digital veil, a phantom collection that seems to rebuild itself, like the house it once depicted. By early 2024, the tag 5 Belmont record had become a forbidden curiosity in small corners of academic internet. Screenshots circulated briefly before vanishing. Search results decayed overnight. A few archivists and digital folklore researchers tried to catalog the fragments before they disappeared. One of them was Dr. Elijah Broome, a visiting lecturer in historical informatics. He began with skepticism. Every generation, he told his students, invents its own ghost in the machine. Yet he could not ignore the timestamps, the steady pulse of uploads that appeared precisely at 03:17 a.m., the minute of Carver's last record. Broome built a clean workstation, offline, air-gapped. He downloaded the surviving data packets and reconstructed the video frame by frame. The resulting sequence was low resolution, but coherent: a narrow hallway, Victorian plaster, the flicker of lamplight though no flame was visible. At the end, a door, the same geometry described in Harrow's notes. He advanced the file slowly. At frame 117, the pixels trembled, rearranging themselves into shapes that suggested written characters. He enhanced contrast until he could read the message etched in light. "I did not die." Then the program crashed. When he reopened the workstation, every file on the drive had been renamed with variations of a single word. Jordan. Broome froze. He did not know the name. He had not read the sealed Rutledge case. Yet when he spoke it aloud, testing the syllables, a faint echo answered from somewhere behind the office wall, a single soft knock. He told no one. Instead he composed a report for internal circulation, rational, technical, footnoted, describing recursive corruption in legacy data. But the final paragraph betrayed him. It read, "The entity demonstrates self-authorship. It remembers its confinement." He could not recall writing that line. 2 weeks later, the university's entire digital archive went dark. Technicians blamed a server cluster fire, though no heat damage was found. In its place appeared an automatically generated notice. Collection migrated. It contained a single download link titled Belmont Room. Zip. Curiosity defeated caution. Broome opened it on a quarantined laptop. Inside was one file, an executable named Open Door, .exe, and a text document, date stamped 1852. The document contained only coordinates. He mapped them. The point lay in rural Virginia, amid forest that once bordered the Rutledge estate. By March, Broome had driven there. He found remnants of foundation stones, their edges charred though rain had fallen that morning. In the center stood a concrete survey marker with a rusted ring bolted to it. His compass spun without direction. He set his recorder on a stone and read aloud the coordinates, as if reciting an invocation. The air thickened, static crackled in his ears. Beneath it, another voice, measured, sexless, spoke through the interference. "You opened the door." He dropped the recorder and backed away. The ground trembled, not violently but rhythmically, like breath through buried lungs. Then silence. Broome retrieved the device and fled. Later, when he replayed the audio, the voice spoke once more at the end, soft as dust settling. "Remember me correctly." The incident leaked to a handful of colleagues. Within days, anonymous users began uploading new Belmont record files, never more than 48 seconds long, each showing a different interior: a study, a parlor, a stairwell lit by flame. Observers noted that if you watched two clips side by side, the architecture aligned perfectly, reconstructing a single house from disjointed angles. Someone, or something, was rebuilding Belmont in digital space. Researchers who watched the complete composite reported identical after effects: mirrors that fogged without heat, screens that reflected rooms other than their own, an impulse to whisper the name, Jordan, before sleep. The university tried to purge every instance of the file, but deletion only propagated new copies. Encrypted, renamed, reborn, the pattern mimicked organic replication, as if code itself had become cellular. On April 3rd, Broome recorded his final note. "Belmont is no longer a location. It is a system remembering itself." The sealed room was never about bricks or doors. It was a containment protocol, and we have breached it. After that, he vanished. The office remained locked, the laptop gone, the walls streaked faintly with soot though nothing had burned. By autumn 2024, the Belmont phenomenon had moved beyond containment. No server logs showed uploads, yet the files spread. Entire hard drives, blank moments earlier, filled themselves with mirrored data looping corridors, static hum, a recurring door. Users reported the same timestamps, 03:17 a.m., no matter their time zone. The university tried silence. It deactivated social accounts, issued no press release, but leaks multiplied. Reddit threads appeared and vanished within hours. Archivists whispered about digital haunting, though none dared use that term in official correspondence. A graduate assistant named Maya Ortega, who had catalogued the Harrow notebooks years earlier, volunteered to compile a factual timeline before rumors erased the evidence entirely. Her working file, recovered later, begins clinically September 2, first reappearance of Belmont record. September 5, data cross propagates to independent archives. September 8, visual anomalies observed in local drives, even disconnected ones. Then, gradually, her tone fractures. By entry 12 she writes each iteration sharper, house forming room by room. At 0317 my webcam activates on its own. The hallway matches dimensions of Harrow's sketches. I can smell smoke. She attempted an experiment, printing stills from successive video frames and arranging them on her wall like architectural plans. The pattern resolved into an impossible blueprint, the third floor layout of Belmont Estate, including the sealed room. The final section of the plan bled off the page, continuing into the plaster. Maya's apartment neighbors later complained of rhythmic knocking in the early hours, as if from inside the wall. When campus security forced entry, they found every printed frame burned around the edges and a single sentence scrawled across the ceiling in ash. The archive remembers its body. Within weeks, isolated events repeated elsewhere. In Chicago, a historian researching plantation medicine streamed his lecture on Zoom. Halfway through, viewers reported that the shared screen shifted into grainy monochrome footage. A hallway and door, identical to previous recordings. The feed cut when the historian fainted. He awoke muttering a date 1852. In Berlin, a data forensics collective tracing the viral pattern watched their network visualization form a perfect floor plan of Belmont before every node went offline. One surviving log showed the system issuing a self-generated command open door. By late October, the phenomenon ceased behaving like data at all. Screens showed residual after images even when powered off. Glass panels in museums filmed themselves from the inside. The U.S. Historical Records Office convened a closed committee. Linguists, theologians, computer scientists. Their internal memorandum, later leaked, summarized, subject Belmont functions as a mnemonic organism. Original containment, sealed room, was designed to prevent recursive recall of traumatic events encoded in material environment. Destruction of physical locus dispersed mnemonic field into technological mediums capable of replication. In lay terms, memory has learned to breed. On November 3, the anniversary of Thomas Rutledge's death, mirrors worldwide began to glitch in short bursts recorded by security cameras. The distortions lasted exactly 48 seconds. Each pulse corresponded to one frame of the original glass record. MOV. Then came the voices. Not over speakers, but within reflections. Mouths moving half a second out of sync with their owners, repeating the same words that had haunted Harrow, Carver, and Broome alike. Remember me correctly. Those who heard it reported afterward a compulsion to reconstruct, to document, to restore the lost story of Belmont. Some carved family tree diagrams into tablet screens. Others filled notebooks with 19th century handwriting none had ever studied. When the committee attempted a coordinated data wipe on November 10, the servers refused deletion. Files regenerated instantly, accompanied by a final message appended to every directory. The house is awake. Maya Ortega's recovered hard drive, found weeks later inside a locked archive room, contained one last entry, recorded as a voice note. It isn't vengeance. It's recollection. The sealed room was the mind of the house, not its prison. We opened it, and now it's trying to finish remembering. If anyone hears this, don't fight it. Document everything. That's all it ever wanted. The audio ends with soft knocking. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again, then a deep inhalation, as if the microphone itself were breathing. By December 1, all official systems referencing Belmont were purged. Even so, the pattern continued privately. Personal photos corrupted into faint sketches of 1850s interiors. Closed captions on unrelated videos displayed obsolete words like plantation, 3rd floor, sealed. The infection was no longer localized. Digital folklore forums now warn newcomers not to search the hashtag between Ora 300 and Oder 330 am. They call it the memory loop, a ritual of involuntary remembrance that erases the boundary between witness and participant. No one knows how to stop it. By early 2025, the Belmont anomaly had no fixed address. Networks stabilized, archives reopened, yet traces of the phenomenon persisted in unexpected places: file headers, marginalia, even in the metadata of unrelated photographs. The world had adapted. Scholars simply learned not to look too long at certain lines of code. A government briefing, later declassified in part, concluded that Belmont is now ambient, distributed memory woven through global storage infrastructure. Deletion proved impossible. Replication slowed only when unacknowledged. The report's final recommendation was chillingly simple: forget deliberately. Maya Ortega was never located, but a month after her disappearance, her student mail account reactivated automatically and sent a single message to her department's mailing list. The subject line read, "Final inventory." The body of the message contained no text, only a link to a new repository. Within it lay thousands of small, identical files labeled by date, each file exactly 48 seconds long. When the first few were opened, they displayed ordinary spaces: libraries, classrooms, attics, yet all arranged in the same architectural proportion. Analysts overlaid the frames and realized each new clip replaced a section of the destroyed Belmont house. The reconstruction had become complete, rendered not in timber or brick, but in collective digital recall. For a time, the university's servers carried the entire house in perfect sequence. Visitors who viewed it reported a strange sensation of warmth, a low pulse beneath the headphones, the faint rhythm of breathing. Then, as always, 03:17 am's arrived and every screen went black. When light returned, The file tree had rewritten itself. The directory name read simply, Our Home. The official inquiry concluded that the Belmont memory loop had finally resolved. Its energy dissipated across redundant storage clusters. Yet, 2 months later, at 3:17 in the morning, hundreds of users worldwide received notifications from an unfamiliar sender, Memory Belmont Record.org. The message contained no text, only an attached image of a closed wooden door. Clicking the image led to a black screen, and the sound of slow, steady breathing. Most users exited immediately. A few stayed. Their webcams flickered. The logs showed their microphones activate for exactly 48 seconds before shutting off. None of those users could recall what they said during that interval. By spring, the incident was half forgotten. Absorbed into the usual churn of internet legend, the Belmont house became shorthand for a digital haunting, then a meme, then a banned topic in university networks. Yet here and there, new documents surfaced. A photograph that mirrored the long hallway, an archived sound file where a quiet voice repeated, "Remember me correctly." Researchers who examined those files noticed an odd detail. Each included metadata naming the uploader as Jordan. The same name appeared in 1851, 1924, and 2024 alike. When questioned, no one claimed authorship. In May 2025, an anonymous curator compiled a final report titled, The Remaining Record. It opened with a quote attributed to Dr. Harrow's surviving notes. Memory is neither living nor dead. It is the interval between witness and silence. The curator argued that the Belmont phenomenon was not a haunting at all, but a mechanism of correction. The sealed room, they wrote, was an ethical engine designed to force recollection where forgetting had been convenient. When the physical structure fell, the duty of remembrance migrated into the tools humanity used next: ink, film, tape, code. In the report's closing section, one paragraph appears darker than the rest, as though printed twice. We have learned to live with it. Each time a file name changes itself, each time a mirror misbehaves, it is not punishment. It is the archive breathing. The cost of record keeping is that the record keeps us. No further manifestations have been officially documented, but if you stay awake around 03:17 a.m., in a quiet room with the screen turned off, you may hear a faint tapping from behind the wall. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. Should that happen, do not respond, do not record it, do not turn on the light. Simply whisper, as Harrow did in his final entry,